very honored to have Smoky from Berachain. First thing, can you do a quick self-intro?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me here, guys. There's actually kind of a running bit because for the last 2-3 years, I've been trying to make it out to speak here, and then every time I ended up rugging like you last second. So I told them this time I'd finally make it out, so thank you for not blocking me from coming up here. A little bit of context on myself, co-founder, CEO, the guy who tweets, whatever that means, at Berachain. I think my background is that I spent the first half of my career in medical technologies, so basically biotech, pharmaceuticals, building drugs and taking them from 0 to 1. Spent a little while in VC/private equity, largely early stage seed and Series A deals, and then some work in the pre-IPO/SPAC era. Have been in crypto since 2015/2016. First just as a degenerate gambler, then as a different form of a degenerate gambler, then a yield farmer, and then at some point a little bit more sophisticated, and started building Berachain very much by accident in 2021, starting with a multiplying NFT project and then eventually turning into a layer 1 blockchain. And we launched a little bit earlier this year. Have been fortunate to spend time with the alt layer guys, collaborate on some things happening within the layer 2 ecosystem on Berachain, and here we are.
Yeah, it sounds amazing. So we know that you guys are going to do a sort of upgrade in, I think, tomorrow, right? And can you share a little bit more, like sort of what are the new features and what are the new improvements we will have for the upgrade?
Yeah, so over the last little while, we've been, I'd say, taking some of the parts of the stack that were, I'd say, a little bit more manual, if you will, and baking it into the actual EVM for Berachain. So just as a little bit of context, I think the reason that people sometimes care about Berachain is due to something that we call proof of liquidity.
Yes.
And what proof of liquidity means more than anything else is that the blockchain's emissions and block rewards or native resources are not solely going towards stakers of the Bera token, which is a little bit of a change from the traditional proof of stake model. In proof of stake, you're saying, I'm going to put up capital in exchange for security. Sort of that, like that's the exchange between the validators and the stakers of the token on the network. In the case of proof of liquidity, the exchange is actually that the applications on the chain are going to receive emissions from the validator set in exchange for incentives from those applications. You can think of it as an incentive marketplace or sort of like an aerodrome-like bribe market at scale at the chain level. The reason we think that's quite interesting is because simply it means that the chain is actually rewarding the applications that are driving the most fundamental value back to the users and back to the token holders, because the applications which are able to actually win those block reward auctions, if you will, tend to be the ones that are producing the most revenue, that have the most TVL, that have the greatest user bases, and they're actually rewarding those users of the network and the stakers of the Bera token, not just in more Bera token, but instead in actually hard money at times, or harder money, whether that be Bitcoin, ETH, stable, so on and so forth, that are a product of their actual function as an app. So we think about it as I'd say an inbuilt or an enshrined means of helping these businesses scale. So what we've done at the network level is, while Berachain started as an entirely EVM identical system, which is to say, like one-to-one, ETH spec, all the EIPs are one-to-one, all the opcodes are one-to-one, so beyond compatibility by identicality. What we've been looking at doing over time is enshrining the proof of liquidity mechanism into the actual EVM itself, as opposed to living on the smart contract layer. So taking some of the stuff around the incentive distribution and the ways that block rewards actually flow from the validator set to the actual protocols on the chain and baking it into the chain itself, as opposed to having it live on top of the EVM itself. So, this upgrade, the hard fork that's going live, is going to push some of that. It's going to make some changes to the gas prices to make sure the transactions are optimally efficient on the chain. A little column A, a little column B.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, right, you're really the inventor of the term like proof of liquidity. So it's been for some time, like sort of it's sort of running on chain. So what are the like sort of good things and pro and cons you learned for the POL? I mean,
for sure. I think what we've learned where POL works and where it doesn't work, right? And I think that what we initially thought is that POL would be very powerful for the 0 to 1 stage. Yeah. Right? And I think in certain cases that makes sense, where you have, like, for example, a derivatives platform that often faces a bit of a cold start problem for liquidity, but then can make a good amount of money, right? What we've actually found is that proof of liquidity tends to work better from the 1 to 100 stage, if that makes sense. So a protocol is already finding a little bit of product market fit, and it's actually a matter of accelerating that demand, as opposed to saying, okay, we need to find demand in the first place. right? So it often works when a business is starting to make revenues, is starting to get a little bit more profitable. Maybe for every dollar they're putting out, they're getting 80 cents back, and they need to find a way to reach the critical mass that takes that from 80 cents for a dollar to $1.10 for a dollar, right? And that's where proof of liquidity actually helps to, in some ways, like sort of subsidize that customer acquisition cost to lifetime value, or that CAC to LTV ratio that allows an application to really scale. So we found it's very interesting when you have an app that's like, getting to PMF and then just needs to add fuel to the fire. And we've seen that, quite successfully, even within certain DeFi applications. So, I think a pretty good example of this was the team at Dolomite. They're a money market. The CEO, Corey, is also the CTO of Trump's for Liberty Finance. As they integrated proof of liquidity on a few pairs, including Bera and some stablecoins, between, those loops, they basically quadrupled their TVL over this course of a couple of months. And they found that it was actually working very well, because as a lending market, the more supply capital they're able to take in, the better spreads they're able to offer, the more revenue they make as a protocol, and the more people want to actually use them, right? So there's ways that can snowball quite well. On the other hand, I think what we also found was that proof of liquidity can go beyond just liquidity provision, which we didn't initially think about quite as much. There was a lot of theory crafting, but there wasn't a lot of application. So it's not just, hey, I'm going to incentivize a UniV3 or UniV2 LP. I'm not just going to incentivize a single-sided deposit in this vault protocol. What actually gets very interesting is when you identify a series of on-chain actions that are sort of profitable or desirable for your protocol, and then build a token representation of that. So let's say that your protocol has a real inflection point in user retention after people using it for 5 days, right, and logging on every day for 5 days. Or let's say that you have an inflection point after people bet X dollars in total volume, right? What became interesting was proof of liquidity finding this more abstract, non-direct linear liquidity use case, and saying, okay, this is actually almost the milestone or the event that needs to be accomplished for this protocol to really succeed, and then being used to directly incentivize that. So I think that's how it actually ends up scaling, interestingly, outside of DeFi as well.
I see. So as you mentioned, right, it's a uniqueness of POL. Basically can really enable a bunch of these new types of application, right? We also chat a little bit a few days ago at KBW, right? This Hack Summit event. You share a little bit more, it's kind of new cool applications on Berachain. Can you also share here with the audience?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that the broad theme for applications on Berachain that we've seen is I think one of 2 or 3 categories. I think that we always try to find a way to put a little bit of a different spin on things, whether that's sitting on stage in a bear mask, or starting a community group full of women that everyone either loves or hates, the bear baddies, or I think that people are down to do interesting things on Berachain, right? And a lot of them are quite experimental. And I think that what we're trying to transition that into, while maintaining the same spirit, is taking assets, or I'd say different, I think assets is the right word, different products that people would not traditionally be able to get exposure to in the Web 2 world, and actually bringing them on chain. But that's not just the classic, hey, we're going to tokenize some T-bills, no offense to people who are doing that, to be clear, but I also think that there's a lot of people competing in that same ring. What we've been thinking about is how can you actually build interesting sort of DeFi applications or self-sustaining revenue-generating loops that benefit from being on-chain around real businesses? Because I think that right now we're at the space in the industry where there's real tailwinds for crypto and TradFi merging in a manner that isn't just a joke, and that actually is supported by some of the best and brightest. So, for example, there's a group called Liquid Royalty that is speaking at our conference shortly, and their whole thing is that they take the top line revenues of top earning Amazon eShops, and they tokenize that and they put that on chain. And it's okay, why would you do that, right? But the reason is that these are the folks that effectively power the back end of some of the stores that you'll just see on the top of your Amazon page, right? You're buying a battery pack, you're buying a sports bra, whatever it is. You don't think too much about who that supplier is. You think about whether the rating is good, whether the price is good, and whether you'll be able to get it in a day or two. A lot of these groups are OEM manufacturers in Shenzhen. They don't have easy access to growth capital. If they try to IPO, they're often trading at 6x EBITDA, so it's not very desirable. And the thing is, they don't want to sell equity. they're printing money. They actually want to be able to leverage that and bring on, working capital, and people won't lend against them even on a PO basis. So what these guys actually do is they bring that capital, those royalty tokens on chain that entitle the holders to effectively constant dividends or royalty flows from their real business that's printing money. And then they're actually going to build a stack that allows people to borrow against these royalty tokens, to do yield swaps, Pendle style, and to build an actual, DeFi ecosystem around these cash flowing assets that would typically look like something that would end up being bundled into like a private credit fund. So we think stuff like that's very fascinating. I think on like the cultural side, on the far other side of things, there's groups like Starglow, which are actually from the Korean ecosystem, and they're working with basically K-pop stars and K-pop idols to tokenize their ownership and their royalties of different, basically albums, shows, like tours, etc., and actually allow their fans to basically A, have an engagement platform, and B, upside in their sales. So I think on one hand, there's the whole like, let's give people access to stuff they couldn't get access to, and actually build a DeFi stack around it. The other side that I think is very fascinating is just tapping into this like consumerized world of like, I think just dopaminergic interactions that are hyper gambling by nature. Mm-hmm. And that like there's the far left side of like, okay, we're building businesses and we're putting them on chain and we're building a stack around them. On the other hand, it's just we're building things that are kind of fried but could be very fun. So for example, there's a guy who we met who basically went viral on Instagram. One of the guys on my BD team met him at like when he was at 200 followers, and he was challenging people in the streets of New York to random bets. And he was like, "How many grapes can I fit in my mouth?" Right? It was that degree of ridiculous stuff. And what actually ended up happening was he basically growth hacked this account with clip farms and all that stuff to 15, 20K followers. And he's building a group buying / gambling app for Gen Zs called Scrambled. So you're probably familiar with Pinduoduo, right? Yeah. Which I think very much revamped the group buying or financial game in many ways in China. And what he wants to do is he thinks about where Gen Zs go to shop, and obviously there's lots of different options, and you can just go to Uniqlo or H&M or whatever it is. But I think there's no centralized place, if you will, where everyone goes to buy things. And also students are poorer than ever in terms of relative purchasing power. So what he's actually built is an app that allows you to like group buy / group gamble on things with your friends. Let's say you want to buy a pair of sneakers that's $180 or $200, but you don't have that. A bunch of your friends and you pitch in $20 a piece. Someone spins, and then someone ends up winning that. They can instantly cash it out if they'd like those collectibles platforms, and get 80 to 85% back. And on the back end, it's just a drop shipping operation. Sounds incredibly fried to start, but then you think about the fact that they're live on a number of different college campuses. They have nearly 10,000 people using their beta right now. The guy started fulfilling these orders by hand, and he didn't actually drop out. He's the president of his class at Stanford, and has been making it go viral by adjacency. And he thinks about using proof of liquidity and Berachain as a way to actually improve the odds of people playing these games and give them sort of like a cash back type of system. So I think that these sorts of apps that can also very much tap into the like sort of algorithmic distribution culture that we're moving into, where people, do something that's worthy of attention and then clip the fuck out of it and then have it going on all these faceless accounts across every different exchange possible. It gets quite interesting because I think that in the same way that we're seeing all this buzz around prediction markets, I think what we're just getting to is like people want to use crypto rails in some way. They want to use it for better settlements. They want to use it for better payments. They want to use it for access to credit, ease of transfer. They don't want to know they're using crypto. I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. I don't think people care about using crypto. I think people care about crypto solving a problem for them. And if they find out it's crypto after, they're probably not mad about it.
Yeah, that's also something I always feel super excited to chat with Smoky, because he's really always at this front line talking to all these new startups and also these Gen Z and this kind of like devs and even some like sort of the very young kids and about their thoughts and ideas. So then my follow-up question, right, the crypto is changing super fast. And narrative after narrative, and basically every week is a new hype. It's like if you couldn't ride on the wave, is basically like immediately, like basically your time is gone. So I really want to ask you about like, do you have any advice for these new startups? Because you talk to all these bunch of new applications and young people, right? How like what kind of advice you want to give to them, like to really fit into the existing crypto industry?
I think that the black pill answer there, honestly, is that if you try to chase the narrative 9 out of 10 times, you're going to get burned. Because I think, like as we've seen, right, like the meta has changed so quickly that unless you have a product that's ready to go, that perfectly fits or that can be very quickly like retrofitted for a given narrative at that moment in time, by the time you actually refactor or make that change, that narrative is gone. Right, like we saw how quickly things have moved across ZK, modularity, restaking, Bitcoin L2s, like God knows what, right? Like, and I think the best teams will find a way to adapt to where the future is heading, but they won't necessarily just chase that narrative. So my actual advice to teams, albeit a little bit cliche, is that your best bet is not to try to subscribe to a given narrative. It's to create your own narrative. Right, and what is a narrative? I think it's mostly bullshit, to be quite honest. It's a bunch of people saying the same thing a bunch of times. There isn't some narratives have more weight than others, to be clear, right? Like I think that being able to say, okay, like the stablecoin narrative or something, like I think that does have more gravitas and more legitimacy. But I think a lot of these are just they're fly by night in a sense, right? It's like internet capital markets gate. What the fuck does that mean, right? Like, and I'm just throwing out one in random, right? So I think the biggest thing is like don't try to follow the crowd and don't try to just figure out how quickly you can shove yourself into a given category. Figure out how you can make yourself the new category, and then have a bunch of people try to copycat you, right? And we saw this to some extent with proof of liquidity. I have lots of respect for the teams that try to build things similarly, like Inisha or Corn. Groups that are basically saying, okay, the validator set will then send emissions to the chain and its applications. I think it's great to be in a position where you're saying, hey, I started this meta, and of course, ideally, you find a way to continue evolving and iterating on it.
Yeah. And then time is up, but I still have my last question. Like we're talking about these new apps, startups, your advice to sort of these new sort of startups, right? So my last question, for the next 5 years, what, in your opinion, what's the most promising direction? Yeah.
Oh God, that's a loaded question, man. I don't think there's one, which is a bit of a cop-out answer, but it's also truthful. I do think that the biggest wins or the most sustainable wins will come from what is probably a little bit boring, but will come from, I think, Web 2 businesses being able to effectively retrofit Web 3 Rails very quickly.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like I actually, when I just think about what is it that causes a company to say, hey, I want to be able to go on chain, like I want to add this overhead to my development, I want to add this overhead to my, education for people, everything in between. There has to really be some win, right? I think when I look at groups that have physical purchase orders and settlement times, I think that's a very clear, obvious one. I also am very fascinated, or I think there's a lot of big wins that will come from access to credit on chain. So a lot of these solutions that use ZKTLS, which is in my opinion big fancy word for you enter your password on a website for your bank, and you're actually able to verify it via crypto means, and then access that Web 2 information from Web 3. I think that gets really interesting because I think you can borrow and lend at much better rates on chain, and I think that can actually have meaningful knock-on effects from a global credit point of view. So there's a couple teams in the Berachain ecosystem, of course, biases here, that are building in that space. But I think it's just one that's interesting, right? Being able to take out a loan on chain against your real life credit score is fascinating and overall much more convenient. And it's the same reason that in many cases it's easier to use Aave sometimes than it is to actually go and take out a line of credit, et cetera, right? So I think we'll see a lot of wins there. And I think we'll see a lot of wins at the intersection of that and people, building their companies on chain in a retrofitting manner.
Yeah, it's amazing Fireside with Smoky. And thanks everyone for listening, and I hope you enjoy the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, guys.